porcelain shattered against hardwood, slicing through the low murmur of jazz and clinking crystal. Sadie didn't feel her knees hit the floor. She only felt the crushing weight of 72 hours without sleep, the phantom ache in her empty arms, and the harsh glare of chandeliers fading to black. She expected the cold indifference of a busy restaurant. She didn't expect the city's most dangerous man to catch her, or the terrifying silence when he found the plastic baby bottle rolling from her spilled purse. The kitchen of Laura smelled of charred rosemary, brown butter, and the sharp metallic tang of Sadie's own mounting panic. She stood by the plating station, her cheap orthopedic shoes slipping slightly on the greased linoleum. The heat lamps beamed down on the back of her neck, raising a fine layer of sweat that glued the stiff collar of her polyester uniform to her skin. Her hands, rough and cracked at the knuckles from cheap dish soap, trembled as she reached for the silver tray holding Table 4's veal chops. Just 2 more hours, she told herself. The mantra felt hollow. She had been awake for 3 days, surviving on the cold crusts of toast left on plates she cleared, half-empty cups of lukewarm tap water, and the primal, terrifying adrenaline of being a mother who was completely out of options. Her rent was due in 3 days. Her son, Finn, had outgrown his winter coat, and she owed her neighbor, a chain-smoking cynic named Mrs. Gable, $50 she didn't have for watching him today. "Table 7 needs another bottle of the Barolo," hissed Richard, the floor manager, walking past her without looking. "And for God's sake, Sadie, fix your apron. You look like you slept in a dumpster." Sadie swallowed the dry lump in her throat and tightened the strings around her waist. She hoisted the heavy tray onto her shoulder. The muscles in her lower back screamed, a tight, burning wire of pain that radiated down her left leg. She pushed through the swinging double doors into the dining room. The contrast between the kitchen and the floor was always a shock to the system. Back there, it was a shouting, sweating engine room. Out here, it was a hushed sanctuary of wealth. The lighting was low and amber, reflecting off crystal wine glasses and the polished mahogany tables. The air smelled of expensive perfume, truffle oil, and old money. Table 7 was in the back corner, secluded behind a lattice of fake ivy. Sadie knew who sat there. Everyone did. Roman Gallo didn't come to Laura to be seen. He came because he owned the building, the block, and halfway up the district. He sat with his back to the wall, a glass of sparkling water untouched in front of him. He wore a charcoal wool suit that looked soft enough to melt. But there was nothing soft about the man. His jaw was a hard, unforgiving line, covered in a faint shadow of stubble. His eyes, dark and unreadable, tracked the movement of the room with the slow, methodical rhythm of a predator calculating distance and escape routes. Sadie kept her gaze on the floor as she walked past him toward Table 4. She didn't want to look at him. Men like Roman Gallo were dangerous because they noticed things, and Sadie was trying very hard to be invisible. But her body was failing her. The static started in her ears halfway across the dining room, a low, buzzing hum like a broken television. Her vision narrowed, the edges of the room blurred, dissolving into grey fuzz. She felt the sudden, alarming sensation that the floor was tilting upward. She stopped. She tried to suck in a breath, but her lungs felt like they were packed with wet sand. No, not now. Please, not now. She took a step. Her left knee simply ceased to function. It gave way, buckling under the weight of the silver tray. The crash was catastrophic. Plates shattered, glasses exploded. Hot veal and brown butter sauce splattered across the imported Persian rug. Sadie hit the ground hard, her hip bone cracking against the hardwood. The breath left her lungs in a sharp, violent wheeze. The low hum of the restaurant went dead silent. Sadie lay there for a second, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how to command her limbs to move. She needed to get up. Richard was going to fire her. She couldn't get fired. If she got fired, they would end up on the street. She forced herself up on one elbow. Her canvas tote bag, which she had hidden under the host's stand because her locker was broken, had been knocked over by a fleeing busboy. The zipper had burst. Her life spilled onto the polished floor. A battered tube of lip balm, a handful of loose pennies, a final notice electricity bill, and a plastic baby bottle. It was cheap. The plastic was slightly cloudy from too many washes in boiling water, and the yellow silicone nipple was chewed at the edges. It rolled across the floor, spinning slowly through a puddle of spilled red wine, coming to a stop directly beside a pair of polished black leather Oxfords, Roman gallows shoes. Through the ringing in her ears, Sadie heard the heavy, terrifying silence of the room. She looked up. Roman had stood up. He didn't look at the mess of food. He didn't look at the furious, red-faced manager rushing across the floor. He was looking down at the baby bottle resting against his shoe. Slowly, Roman crouched. The movement was fluid, entirely at odds with his massive frame. He picked up the bottle with long, scarred fingers. He turned it over, studying the cheap plastic, the measurement lines worn away by friction, the tiny tooth marks on the nipple. Then, his dark eyes shifted to Sadie. There was no pity in his stare. Pity would have been easy to digest. What Sadie saw in his eyes was far worse. It was a cold, surgical curiosity. He was dissecting her, the stained uniform, the hollowed-out cheeks, the desperate, clawing panic in her chest. He saw all of it in a fraction of a second. "Sadie!" Richard's voice cut through the fog, shrill and furious. "What the hell is wrong with you? Get up! You're making a scene in front of Mr. Gallo." Sadie tried to push herself up, but her arms gave out. The world tilted violently. The amber lights smeared into a blinding streak of white, and the last thing she felt was the cold floor rushing up to meet her face before the darkness swallowed her whole. When Sadie woke, she didn't smell garlic or floor wax. She smelled rich, aged leather, rubbing alcohol, and a faint, sharp scent of cedar. She opened her eyes. The ceiling was low, panelled in dark wood. She was lying on a leather Chesterfield sofa in what looked like Richard's back office, though she had never been allowed inside. A damp paper towel was plastered to her forehead. She tried to sit up, and the room violently spun. Nausea hit her in a heavy wave, forcing her to swallow down a mouthful of bile. "Don't move," the voice came from the shadows by the desk. It wasn't loud, but it possessed a dense, gravitational weight that demanded immediate compliance. Sadie froze. She turned her head, the damp paper towel sliding off her brow. Roman Gallo was sitting in Richard's oversized swivel chair. He looked entirely out of place in the cramped office, his broad shoulders dwarfing the furniture. He didn't have his jacket on. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the thick cords of his neck. He was holding the baby bottle. He wasn't just holding it. He was rotating it slowly between his thumb and forefinger, examining it as if it were a piece of forensic evidence. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded Sadie's veins. She patted her hip, searching for her apron. It was gone. She looked around frantically and saw her cheap canvas tote bag resting on the floor near Roman's boots. "Where is Richard?" Her voice cracked, sounding like dry leaves. "Upstairs, dealing with the mess you made," Roman replied. He didn't look up from the bottle. $600 in ruined food, another $2,000 for the rug. Sadie squeezed her eyes shut. "Fired! I'm fired! I'm ruined!" The math began running in her head, a terrifying ticker tape of negative numbers. Rent, formula, diapers, the heating bill. She felt the sting of tears behind her eyes, but bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper to stop them. She would not cry in front of this man. "I can pay it back," she lied. The lie tasted like ash. "If they dock my wages, you're not working here anymore," Roman said. It was a flat statement of fact. "Please!" Sadie forced herself to sit up, ignoring the swimming nausea. She clutched the edge of the leather sofa. "You don't understand. I need this job. I'll clean the floors. I'll do the prep shifts nobody wants." "You passed out from malnutrition and exhaustion," Roman interrupted, finally looking at her. His eyes were the color of wet slate. "Your heart rate was barely registering when my men carried you back here. You are a liability to the restaurant. I'm just tired." "You're starving." Roman tossed the plastic bottle onto the desk. It landed with a hollow clatter. "And you have a child." Sadie's breath hitched. She looked at the bottle, then at her open bag. "You went through my things." "Your things spilled onto my shoes," Roman corrected evenly. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Formula. Not breast milk. Meaning you're away from the baby for 12, maybe 14 hours at a time. The nipple is chewed, older baby. Maybe 6, 7 months, teething. And judging by the fact that you are working a double shift on a Friday night while looking like you're ready for a coroner's slab, whoever is watching the kid isn't doing it out of the kindness of their heart." Sadie stared at him, her chest heaving. It was terrifying how quickly he had dismantled her life from a piece of cheap plastic. "What time were you supposed to pick him up?" Roman asked. Sadie looked at the clock on the wall. The red digital numbers glared at her. 11:45 p.m. The blood drained from her face entirely. Oh, God! She was 3 hours late. Mrs. Gable had told her she would call child services if Sadie was ever late again. The old woman hated the crying, hated the inconvenience, and hated Sadie's constant begging for extensions on her childcare payments. Sadie threw her legs over the side of the couch and tried to stand. Her knees buckled immediately, but she caught herself on the edge of a filing cabinet, her breath hissing through her teeth. "Sit down," Roman ordered. "I have to go," Sadie gasped, limping toward her bag. She snatched it off the floor, her hands shaking so violently she could barely shove the plastic bottle inside. "I have to get my son." "You can't walk." "I'll crawl if I have to." She spat, a sudden, fierce anger piercing through her fear. She didn't care who he was. She didn't care about the rumors of broken kneecaps or the bodies pulled out of the river. He was standing between her and Finn. "Stay out of my way." Roman didn't move. He watched her hobble toward the door, his expression unreadable. He had spent his entire life surrounded by men who feigned strength, men who puffed out their chests and spoke in threats. He knew what fake courage looked like. But this woman wasn't faking. She was utterly broken, physically destroyed, and yet she was dragging herself toward the door with the mindless, feral determination of a cornered animal. It bothered him. It irritated the cynical, calloused edges of his mind. He preferred the world to be predictable. People worked for money. They betrayed for power. They died when they were careless. This woman, destroying herself for a child she could barely afford to keep alive, defied his grim logic. As Sadie reached for the brass doorknob, her fingers slipped. The dark edges of her vision began to creep back in. She swayed, losing her grip on the bag. Before she could hit the floor again, a large hand wrapped around her bicep. The grip was iron hard, stopping her fall instantly. Roman hauled her upright, not gently, but with a firm, stabilizing force. The heat radiating off his body was immense. Sadie smelled the cedar again, underneath the scent of gun oil and starched cotton. "I'm not letting you wander into the street to get hit by a cab," Roman said, his voice a low rumble right next to her ear. "Let me go." "I'm driving you." Sadie stiffened, pulling against his grip, but it was like pulling against a steel beam. "I don't want your help. I know who you are. I don't want anything to do with you." Roman looked down at her. Her eyes were bloodshot, the capillaries broken, her pale face streaked with dirt from the kitchen floor. She was terrified of him, and yet she was glaring at him with pure, unadulterated defiance. "You don't have a choice," Roman said quietly. He didn't smile. He didn't offer comfort. "You owe my restaurant $2,000. Until you pay it off, I decide how you get home. Now, walk." The back of the black SUV was a sensory deprivation chamber. The windows were heavily tinted, blocking out the neon glare of the city. The thick doors shut with a heavy, pressurized thud that muted the sirens and the rain pounding against the roof. Sadie sat pressed against the far door, her wet coat clutching her shoulders, her hands gripping her canvas bag like a shield. She felt the deep, vibrating purr of the engine beneath her boots. In the driver's seat sat a man with a thick neck and a flattened nose, who Roman had addressed only as Dante. He hadn't said a single word since they left the restaurant, just slipped the car into gear and pulled smoothly into the midnight traffic. Roman sat beside her. He took up too much space. Even pressed against his own door, his long legs stretched out, his presence filled the cabin. He was typing a message on a sleek black phone, the blue light illuminating the harsh, sharp angles of his profile. "Address," Roman said, not looking up. Sadie hesitated. She didn't want him knowing where she lived. She didn't want the city's apex predator knowing where her son slept. But the digital clock on the dashboard read 12:15 a.m. Mrs. Gable was probably already packing Finn's things into garbage bags. "South Side," Sadie whispered, her voice raspy. "Tremont Avenue, the brick building past the overpass." Roman's thumb stopped moving for a fraction of a second. He knew Tremont Avenue. It was a dead zone, the kind of neighborhood where the city stopped bothering to replace the blown-out streetlights, where the cops only showed up in daylight and in pairs. It was a place where people went to disappear, or a place they couldn't escape. He tapped on the glass partition. Tremont. Past the overpass. Dante merely nodded. The drive was agonizingly slow, or maybe it just felt that way to Sadie. Every time the car hit a pothole, the pain in her hip flared, reminding her of her collapse. She felt filthy sitting on the pristine, butter-soft leather. The contrast was humiliating. She was a stain in his immaculate world. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. The silence in the car was suffocating her, and her anxiety was making her reckless. Roman finally locked his phone and slid it into his breast pocket. He turned his head slowly. "Doing what?" "This." Sadie gestured vaguely around the luxury cabin. "You could have let Richard throw me in an alley. You don't care about a waitress. You don't care about a spilled veal chop." "I don't like messes in my establishments," Roman replied coldly. "You were a mess. So you put the mess in your car." "I put the mess where I can keep an eye on it," he countered. His voice was smooth, a velvet wrapper over a razor blade. "You passed out in my dining room. If you die of a heart attack on the sidewalk 2 blocks away, the police start asking questions about my restaurant's labor practices. I don't like the police asking questions." It was a perfectly pragmatic, entirely ruthless explanation. It made sense, but Sadie didn't believe it. Not entirely. She remembered the way he had looked at the chewed baby bottle. It wasn't just calculations in his eyes. There was a flicker of something deeply unsettled. The SUV took a sharp turn, the tires hissing on the wet asphalt. The towering glass skyscrapers of downtown faded, replaced by crumbling brick facades, barred windows, and overflowing dumpsters. Dante pulled the car to a stop in front of a narrow, rotting building. The front door was missing its glass pane, boarded up with a piece of swollen plywood. "Wait here," Sadie said, scrambling for the door handle. Her fingers were stiff and uncooperative. "I'm coming up," Roman said. "No." Sadie turned, her voice sharp. Absolutely not. You don't come up there. Roman didn't argue. He just opened his door and stepped out into the freezing rain. Sadie cursed under her breath, forcing her own door open. Her legs wobbled violently as soon as her boots hit the pavement, but she forced herself to walk, marching toward the entrance. The stairwell smelled of boiled cabbage, stale cigarette smoke, and old urine. The radiator in the corner clanked and hissed, a mechanical death rattle. Sadie dragged herself up to the third floor, her lungs burning, ignoring the heavy, measured footsteps of Roman Gallo right behind her. She reached apartment 3B and knocked, her knuckles rapped weakly against the peeling green paint. She waited. She knocked again, harder. "Mrs. Gable, it's me. I'm here." A heavy deadbolt slid back. The door yanked open. Mrs. Gable stood in the doorway, a cigarette dangling from her wrinkled lips, wearing a stained floral bathrobe. In her arms was a baby. Finn. He was crying, a weak, exhausted, raspy sound that tore a physical hole through Sadie's chest. He was wearing a faded grey onesie that was too small for him, his little face red and blotchy. "Give him to me," Sadie gasped, reaching out. Mrs. Gable stepped back, holding the baby out of reach. Her eyes were hard and mean. "You're 4 hours late, Sadie. 4 hours. I got half a mind to call the cops. This kid hasn't stopped screaming since you left." "I'm sorry. I got sick at work. I collapsed. Please, just give him to me. It's $20 an hour for overtime," Mrs. Gable said, taking a drag of her cigarette, the smoke curling around Finn's face. The baby coughed, rubbing his tiny fists against his eyes. "You owe me $80, plus the 50 for the day. Cash. Now." "I don't have it," Sadie pleaded, tears finally breaking free, sliding down her pale cheeks. She dug into her canvas bag, pulling out her frayed wallet. I have $14. I'll get the rest tomorrow, I swear to God." "No cash, no kid," Mrs. Gable sneered. "I'm calling child services. They can deal with you." She moved to slam the door. A large, pale hand caught the edge of the wood. The door stopped dead. Mrs. Gable blinked, looking past Sadie for the first time. Roman stepped out of the shadows of the flickering hallway light. He didn't pull a gun. He didn't raise his voice. He simply occupied the space, a towering, broad-shouldered monolith of dark wool and silent violence. The air in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. Roman looked at the cigarette in the old woman's mouth. Then he looked at the coughing baby. Finally, his dead, slate-grey eyes locked onto Mrs. Gable's face. "Put the cigarette out," Roman said. The command was so quiet it was barely a whisper, but it carried the absolute certainty of an executioner. Mrs. Gable trembled. The mean, extortionist gleam in her eyes vanished, replaced by sheer, primal terror. She spat the cigarette onto the floor and crushed it with her slipper. "Give the mother her child," Roman instructed. Mrs. Gable practically shoved Finn into Sadie's arms. Sadie collapsed against the doorframe, burying her face into her son's neck. He smelled of sour milk and baby powder, but to Sadie it was the smell of the whole world. She wrapped her arms around his small, warm body, rocking him gently. Instantly, the baby's cries began to subside, turning into exhausted, hiccuping sighs as he recognized his mother's heartbeat. Roman watched them. He watched the way the woman, who couldn't even stand on her own 2 feet 5 minutes ago, suddenly turned into an unbreakable fortress around the infant. He reached into his tailored pocket, pulled out a silver money clip, and peeled off a crisp $100 bill. He dropped it onto the floor at Mrs. Gable's feet. "If you ever threaten to take a child from its mother again," Roman said, his voice stripping the paint off the walls, "I won't use the door to come inside. Do we understand each other?" Mrs. Gable nodded frantically, stepping back into her apartment and slamming the door shut, the deadbolt clicking frantically into place. Silence descended on the rotting hallway, save for the soft, wet sounds of Sadie weeping into her baby's thin hair. Roman stood perfectly still. He was a man who dismantled lives. He broke unions, ruined politicians, and buried enemies under concrete. But looking at the bruised, starving woman holding her child in a derelict hallway, Roman Gallo realized a terrifying truth. He didn't want to break her. He wanted to kill whatever had broken her first. Sadie didn't invite him inside. She simply turned the key in her deadbolt, pushed open the splintering door of apartment 3B, and walked in. Roman followed. He didn't ask for permission. Men who owned the city never did. The apartment was freezing. The ambient temperature was colder inside than it was in the hallway, the chill seeping up through the warped linoleum floorboards. There was no entrance hall, just a narrow kitchenette that bled into a single, square room, serving as a living room and bedroom. The air smelled of wet plaster, stale dust, and the metallic tang of an ancient, useless radiator. Sadie didn't turn on the overhead light. She moved by the sickly amber glow bleeding through the window from the street lamp outside. She laid Finn on the mattress, resting directly on the floor. He fussed, his tiny fists kicking at the thin, pillaged quilt she wrapped around him. "I need to make him a bottle," Sadie muttered. She wasn't talking to Roman. She was talking to the walls, to the crushing exhaustion in her own bones. She walked to the kitchen sink and turned the faucet. The pipes groaned, a skeletal rattling sound, before spitting out a stream of rust-tinted water that eventually ran clear. It was ice cold. Roman stood in the doorway. He looked too large for the room, his broad shoulders practically brushing the doorframe. His dark eyes scanned the space, cataloguing the poverty with clinical precision. He saw the black mold blooming in the upper corner of the ceiling. He saw the empty refrigerator, its hum loud and desperate. He saw the stack of final notice bills weighed down by a half-burned candle on the cheap laminate counter. He watched Sadie open a tin of baby formula. She scraped the bottom with the plastic scoop, gathering a meager dusting of white powder. She dumped it into the cloudy bottle, filling the rest with cold tap water. It was colored water, not food. Roman's jaw tightened. A muscle lipped beneath the stubble on his cheek. He had seen men bleed out on warehouse floors. He had ordered violence with the casual flick of his wrist. But watching this starving woman attempt to trick her infant's stomach with chalky water provoked a sharp, ugly twisting in his gut that he couldn't name. Sadie shook the bottle, her hands trembling so badly the plastic rattled. She unscrewed the cap, testing a drop on the inside of her raw, chapped wrist. She squeezed her eyes shut. It was freezing. Before she could turn back to the bed, a large hand closed over her wrist. Sadie gasped, her eyes snapping open. Roman was standing right behind her. She hadn't even heard him move. His grip was entirely unyielding, the heat of his palm scalding against her freezing skin. He took the bottle from her shaking fingers. He didn't say a word. He unscrewed the top and poured the watery mixture down the drain. "What are you doing?" Sadie's voice cracked into a frantic whisper. She clawed at his arm, her nails digging uselessly into the thick wool of his suit. "That was the last of it. That was all I had." Roman ignored her. He pulled his phone from his pocket, dialing a number with his thumb, while holding her off with his forearm. "Dante," Roman said, his voice flat in the dead, quiet room. "Go to the all-night pharmacy on 5th. Buy formula. Enfamil, the pre-mixed kind. Buy diapers, blankets, a space heater. Bring it to the 3rd floor unit." He paused, his eyes locked on the empty, rattling refrigerator. "And get a hot meal, something with iron. 10 minutes." He hung up, sliding the phone away. Sadie backed away from him until her spine hit the edge of the counter. She was breathing hard, her chest rising and falling in ragged, shallow spikes. She didn't look relieved. She looked hunted. "I can't pay you for that," she whispered, the panic clawing at her throat. "I owe you $2,000 for the restaurant. I owe Mrs. Gable. I have $14 to my name. I can't pay you." "I didn't ask for your money," Roman said. "Then what do you want?" The question hung in the freezing air, sharp and desperate. Roman looked at her. Her hair was a tangled, damp mess around her face. The cheap uniform was stained with veal grease and wine. She looked like a casualty of war. "What do I want?" he thought. He wanted the room to be warm. He wanted the hollow, bruised look to leave her eyes. He wanted to find whoever had left her in this rotting box and break their spine. "I want you to sit down before you pass out and crack your skull on my shoes again," Roman said softly, stepping back to give her space. "Sit down, Sadie." It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded strange coming from his mouth, heavy, grounded, like a command disguised as a prayer. Sadie's legs finally gave out. She slid down the front of the cabinets, her knees pulling to her chest. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as the dry, ugly sobs finally tore their way out of her chest. Roman didn't touch her. He didn't offer a platitude. He simply stood guard in the freezing kitchen, a dark sentinel in a ruined world, until Dante walked through the door carrying the bags. The smell of roasted garlic and seared steak woke her. Sadie bolted upright. Disorientation slammed into her like a physical blow. The room was no longer freezing. A quiet orange glow radiated from a heavy-duty ceramic space heater plugged into the far wall. She looked at the mattress beside her. Finn was fast asleep, his chest rising and falling in deep, rhythmic breaths. He was swaddled in a thick, expensive cashmere blanket. Half a dozen bottles of ready-to-feed formula lined the floor near his head. Sadie shoved her tangled hair out of her eyes and looked toward the kitchen. Roman Gallo was sitting at her wobbly, particle-board dining table. He had taken his suit jacket off, draping it over the back of the chair. His sleeves were rolled up to his forearms, exposing thick, corded muscles and a jagged silver scar wrapping around his left wrist. He was typing on a laptop that looked alien in her decaying apartment, a stark juxtaposition of high-end technology and peeling wallpaper. On the table in front of him sat a cardboard takeout box, steam curling lazily from the vents. Sadie swung her legs off the mattress. Her muscles screamed in protest, stiff and bruised from the fall at the restaurant. But the crushing fog of exhaustion had slightly lifted. "Eat," Roman said. He didn't look up from his screen. Sadie walked slowly to the table. She opened the box. It was a ribeye steak, sliced thick, resting on a bed of roasted potatoes and asparagus. Her stomach violently contracted, an audible, hollow growl echoing in the quiet room. She hadn't eaten a solid meal in 3 days. She picked up the plastic fork, her pride completely overridden by primitive hunger. She ate, standing up. She meant to take a small bite, but the taste of the salt and fat hit her tongue, and she couldn't stop. She shoved the food into her mouth, chewing frantically, tears stinging her eyes because she hated how good it tasted. She hated that she was eating his food. Roman finally closed his laptop. The sharp click echoed in the room. He watched her eat with that same intense, unreadable gaze. He waited until she had cleared half the box and her breathing had slowed down. "You owe me $2,680, Roman stated, leaning back in the cheap plastic chair. It creaked under his weight. "That covers the rug, the ruined food, the cash I gave your neighbor, and the supplies Dante bought." Sadie froze, the plastic fork halfway to her mouth. The heavy, warm food in her stomach suddenly felt like lead. The illusion of safety shattered. "I know," she whispered, putting the fork down. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, suddenly feeling filthy under his gaze. I told you, I'll get another job. I can set up a payment plan. $20 a week. 50, once I find a night shift. If you work a night shift, who watches the boy? Roman asked coldly. The woman down the hall who locks him out when you're late? Sadie flinched. I'll figure it out. You haven't figured it out yet, Roman observed, brutal in his honesty. You are running on fumes. You have an eviction notice on your counter, dated for Thursday. It's Tuesday. By Friday, you and the kid are sleeping in a shelter, assuming child services doesn't take him first. Sadie gripped the edge of the table. Her knuckles turned white. Stop it. Stop talking to me like I'm a spreadsheet. I deal in ledgers, Sadie. It's how I survive, Roman said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its business-like edge. And right now, your ledger is bleeding out. You cannot pay me back making minimum wage. I don't accept $20 installments. Panic, pure and suffocating, seized her throat. She stepped back, putting distance between them. So what? You're going to break my legs over $2,000. You're going to hurt me in front of my son. Roman stood up. The sudden movement was terrifying. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. Sadie pressed her back against the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't touch her. He stopped inches away, invading her space, forcing her to look up at him. She could smell the mint on his breath, the faint, metallic scent of the gun she knew he kept holstered under his arm. I don't hurt women, Roman said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that settled in her bones. And I don't break legs over pocket change. Then what? She choked out. You're going to work off the debt, directly for me. Sadie's blood ran cold. Her mind flashed to the rumors she had heard in the restaurant kitchen, the illegal gambling dens, the underground clubs, the women who worked for the Gallo family and never seemed to leave. No, she said instantly, shaking her head. No, I won't do that. I'll die first. Roman's brow furrowed in genuine confusion for a fraction of a second before he realized what she meant. His expression darkened, an insulted, dangerous anger flashing in his grey eyes. I don't run brothels, he snapped, his voice sharp like cracking ice. And I don't buy women. Don't insult me. He stepped back, running a hand through his dark hair, suddenly looking irritated. You know the inventory system at Laura. You know the distributors, the invoices, the delivery schedules. The manager, Richard, has been skimming off the top for 6 months. I fired him an hour ago. Sadie blinked, entirely thrown off balance. You fired Richard? He's lucky he can still walk, Roman muttered darkly. I need someone to audit the back-of-house books, to reorganize the supply chain for all 3 of my restaurants in the district. You work from home. You manage the spreadsheets. You report directly to me. Sadie stared at him. An inventory manager? An archivist, Roman corrected. The pay is $4,000 a month. I deduct $500 for your debt until it's clear. You keep the rest. It was a lifeline. It was a golden ladder dropping down into the dark, suffocating pit she had been drowning in for months. She could stay with Finn. She could pay rent. But Sadie wasn't stupid. She looked at the city's most feared man standing in her kitchen. Why? She asked, her voice trembling. You have accountants with master's degrees. You don't need a fired waitress to audit your books. Why are you doing this? Roman looked at her. He couldn't tell her the truth. He couldn't tell her that when he watched her collapse, something inside his tightly controlled, violent world had fractured. He couldn't tell her that he couldn't leave this apartment because the thought of her freezing in the dark made him want to burn the entire building to the ground. Because you owe me, Roman lied smoothly, his face a perfect, emotionless mask. And I prefer my investments to yield a return. The relocation happened less than 24 hours later. It was not a request. Sadie had spent Tuesday trying to scrub the apartment, trying to make it somewhat livable, while Finn slept off the exhaustion of the past few days. But the reality of Tremont Avenue wouldn't be scrubbed away. At 4 p.m., a fight broke out in the alley below her window. The sharp crack of a gunshot shattered the glass of the streetlight outside, plunging the room back into shadows. Finn woke up screaming. Sadie had thrown herself over his small body on the mattress, her heart pounding against the floorboards, waiting for a bullet to tear through the drywall. When the silence returned, unbroken save for the distant wail of police sirens that would never actually arrive on this street, her flip phone buzzed. It was a restricted number. She answered it with a trembling hand. "Pack your things," Roman's voice came through the receiver, deep and authoritative. "Dante is downstairs. I can't leave. The rent is paid through." "A bullet just went through the brick on the second floor, Sadie," Roman cut her off, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "You are an employee of the Gallo family now. You handle my financial ledgers, which means you are a target. I do not leave my assets unprotected in a war zone." Assets. The word stung, but it was overshadowed by the terror of the gunshot. She packed everything they owned into 3 plastic grocery bags. It was pathetic. A few worn onesies, the tin of formula Roman had bought, her uniform, and a chipped coffee mug Finn liked to chew on. When Dante knocked on the door, he didn't say a word. He just took the plastic bags, his massive hands dwarfing the cheap plastic, and waited for her to carry Finn down the stairs. The drive was silent. They didn't head toward the commercial district or the restaurants. Instead, Dante drove the SUV toward the waterfront, the tires gliding smoothly onto the private, gated compound of the Marina Towers. It was a world Sadie had only seen in glossy magazines left behind by wealthy patrons at Laura. Dante escorted her up the private elevator to the penthouse level. When the steel doors slid open, Sadie stepped out, clutching Finn tightly to her chest. The apartment was sprawling. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glittering expanse of the city skyline and the dark, churning water of the harbor. The floors were poured concrete, polished to a mirror shine, layered with thick, cream-colored Persian rugs. The furniture was sleek, minimalist, and terrifyingly expensive. It smelled like ozone, expensive wax, and the faint, lingering cedar scent of Roman's cologne. "Mr. Gallo owns this unit," Dante said, setting the plastic bags down on the kitchen island. It was a massive slab of black marble. "He uses it occasionally. It's yours until the debt is cleared and you find suitable housing." Sadie walked slowly into the center of the living room. Her orthopedic boots felt loud and vulgar on the pristine rugs. Finn, sensing the change in temperature and air quality, stopped fussing and stared up at the crystal chandelier hanging above the dining table, mesmerized by the light. "He's letting me stay here?" Sadie asked, disbelief heavy on her tongue. "He demands it," Dante corrected softly. He pulled a heavy ring of keys from his pocket and set them on the counter, next to a sleek, brand-new smartphone. "There is security at the lobby. The elevator requires a keycard. No one comes up without my authorization. Your groceries will be delivered. Your work laptop is in the office down the hall." Dante turned to leave. "Wait!" Sadie called out, panic flaring. When does he come back?" Dante paused at the elevator doors. He looked at the ragged, exhausted mother standing in the middle of a multi-million-dollar fortress. "Mr. Gallo is a busy man, but he checks on his investments." The doors slid shut, sealing her in. Sadie stood in the deafening quiet of the penthouse. The contrast between this room and the freezing, mouldy box on Tremont Avenue was so sharp it gave her whiplash. The air here was warm. The doors were steel. She was safe from the gunshots, the freezing rain, and Mrs. Gable. She walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the city below. The cars looked like tiny insects crawling along glowing veins of light. She felt like she was floating above the world, untouched. She walked to the master bedroom. It was massive, dominated by a king-sized bed with crisp white linens. In the corner of the room, starkly out of place against the modern decor, sat a brand-new, hand-carved mahogany crib. Inside it were stacks of diapers, soft cotton blankets, and high-end baby clothes with the tag still on. Sadie reached out, running her calloused, cracked fingers over the smooth wood of the crib. She wasn't stupid. Roman Gallo hadn't brought her here to balance a spreadsheet. Men like him didn't buy mahogany cribs for their accountants. She set Finn down in the center of the massive bed. He immediately rolled over, burying his face in the soft, down comforter, letting out a soft sigh of absolute comfort. He was warm. He was safe. His belly was full. Sadie sat on the edge of the mattress, burying her face in her hands. She had survived poverty. She had survived exhaustion. But as she looked around the gilded, silent cage Roman Gallo had built for her overnight, she realized she was facing an entirely new kind of danger. She had traded the cold brutality of the streets for the terrifying, possessive warmth of a monster. And the scariest part wasn't that she was trapped. The scariest part was that, looking at her sleeping son, she knew she would never try to leave. By the second week, the bruising on Sadie's hip faded to a sickly yellow, and the tremors in her hands finally stopped. She spent her days at the massive mahogany desk in the den, staring at the dual monitors Dante had set up. The work was meant to be a distraction, a thin veil of legitimacy over her captivity. But Sadie attacked the spreadsheets with the frantic, obsessive energy of a woman trying to prove she had a right to breathe the oxygen in the room. The restaurant's books were a mess. Richard hadn't just been skimming from the liquor inventory. He had been creating phantom vendors, funneling thousands of dollars a week into ghost accounts for truffles, imported veal and caviar that never actually hit the loading dock. Sadie tracked every stolen penny. She drank bitter black coffee from bone china cups, her bare feet tucked under her in the plush leather office chair. She listened to the hum of the central heating and the soft, burbling sounds Finn made from his playpen in the corner. She was healing. Her cheeks had lost their gaunt, hollowed-out grayness, replaced by a faint flush of color. But the psychological whiplash of her new reality kept her constantly on edge. She jumped when the ice maker in the refrigerator dropped cubes. She woke up at 3 a.m., heart hammering against her teeth, expecting to find Mrs. Gable standing over the bed, demanding cash. Roman visited on Thursday nights. He never knocked, but he never entered unannounced either. The private elevator would chime, a soft, metallic ping, giving her exactly 30 seconds to brace herself before the heavy steel doors slid open. When he arrived on the 14th day, he brought the freezing rain inside with him. His dark wool overcoat was damp at the shoulders, carrying the sharp scent of ozone, wet asphalt, and the metallic tang of the city. Sadie didn't stand up from the desk. She turned her chair, pulling her oversized cashmere sweater tightly around her ribs. "You're working late," Roman said. He shrugged off the damp coat, tossing it over the back of a suede sofa. Underneath, he wore a black turtleneck that clung to the heavy musculature of his chest and shoulders. He looked less like a businessman tonight, and more like the enforcer the rumors claimed he had once been. "I found the rest of the leak," Sadie said, her voice steady but quiet. She tapped the screen. Richard wasn't acting alone. The shift manager from the seafood supplier was signing off on the ghost deliveries. They split $70,000 over the last 8 months. Roman walked slowly across the room. He didn't look at the monitors. He stopped behind her chair, looking down at the crown of her head. Dante already paid the supplier a visit this morning, Roman murmured. The money has been recovered. Sadie swallowed hard. She didn't want to ask what recovered meant. She didn't want to know what Dante had done to get it back. She kept her eyes on the glow of the spreadsheet. Roman reached over her shoulder. His chest brushed against the back of her chair. Sadie froze, her breath hitching in her throat. His large, scarred hand closed over the computer mouse, his knuckles brushing against her knuckles. His skin was burning hot. The contrast of his rough, calloused thumb against the healing skin of her hand sent a sharp, involuntary jolt up her arm. He clicked the monitor off. The room plunged into the soft amber glow of the desk lamp. "You're done for the day," he said, his voice dropping an octave, rumbling right next to her ear. "I'm not finished organizing the new vendor lists." "I don't care," Roman replied. He stepped back, moving toward the playpen in the corner. Sadie turned her chair, watching him. This was the contradiction that kept her awake at night. She watched the city's most dangerous man lean over the mesh siding of the playpen. Finn was awake, lying on his back, chewing aggressively on a rubber teething ring. Roman reached down. His hand, the same hand that ordered executions and broke bones, scooped the infant up with a terrifying, effortless gentleness. Finn didn't cry. The baby grabbed a fistful of Roman's black turtleneck, drooling a thick streak of spit down the expensive fabric. Roman didn't flinch. He adjusted his grip, resting the baby's head against his collarbone, his large hand completely enveloping Finn's back. "He's heavier," Roman noted, his grey eyes sliding toward Sadie. "He's eating properly," Sadie said, standing up. She crossed her arms, suddenly feeling incredibly vulnerable. "Why are you really doing this, Roman?" He stilled. It was the first time she had used his first name. It sounded raw in the quiet room. "I told you. You owe me." "Stop lying," Sadie snapped. The sudden burst of anger surprised her. It wasn't the frantic, cornered panic she used to feel. It was a grounded, deeply human frustration. $70,000 was a rounding error to you. You didn't need me to find it. You didn't need to put me in a $5 million penthouse. You're keeping me here. Roman looked at her over the baby's head. The air in the room thickened, growing dense and suffocating. "Yes," Roman said simply. There was no hesitation, no denial. "Why?" Roman stepped closer. The absolute lack of hesitation in his gait made Sadie's pulse hammer against her throat. He stopped 2 feet away. He smelled like cedar, gun oil, and pure, unfiltered dominance. "Because I walked into a kitchen and saw a woman bleeding herself dry to keep her child alive. And my first instinct wasn't to help you," Roman said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "My first instinct was to kill everyone who had allowed you to get to that point. That is a liability. I do not tolerate liabilities." "So I'm a liability?" "No," Roman said, his eyes dropping to her mouth before snapping back up to her eyes. "You are an obsession, and I prefer to keep my obsessions where I can see them." Sadie stared at him, her chest rising and falling heavily. It was an ugly, terrifying confession. It wasn't love. It was ownership. It was survival. And God help her. As she looked at the dark, violent man, holding her son safely against his chest, she realized she didn't care. The illusion of safety shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. Sadie was in the kitchen, boiling water to sterilize pacifiers. Finn was asleep in the bedroom. The apartment was dead quiet, save for the low hum of the refrigerator. The private elevator chimed. Sadie didn't look up from the stove. Roman wasn't due until Thursday, but occasionally Dante came up to drop off groceries. The heavy steel doors slid open. But the footsteps that stepped onto the polished concrete weren't Dante's heavy, measured boots. They were sharp, clicking leather soles, dragging slightly at the heel. Sadie turned. A man stood in the foyer. He was thin, wearing a poorly tailored maroon suit that smelled aggressively of stale cigarette smoke and cheap, stinging cologne. His hair was slicked back, and a jagged scar cut through his left eyebrow. He wasn't Roman, and he definitely wasn't Dante. Sadie's blood ran cold. The wooden spoon slipped from her hand, clattering against the marble counter. "Well, well," the man said, his voice a reedy, nasal sneer. He shoved his hands into his pockets, walking slowly into the living room, tracking mud onto the cream Persian rug. Dante wasn't lying. The boss really did buy himself a stray. "Who are you?" Sadie asked. She backed up against the stove. Her hand slid blindly behind her, her fingers wrapping around the handle of a heavy, 10-inch chef's knife resting on the cutting board. "Name's Carmine," the man said, grinning. His teeth were slightly yellowed. "I run the docks for the family. Needed to drop off some shipping manifests. Figured I'd bypass the gorillas downstairs and see the new pet for myself." He stopped at the kitchen island, his eyes dragging up and down Sadie's body. He took in the oversized sweater, the bare legs, the defensive posture. "Roman's getting soft," Carmine chuckled, a nasty, grating sound. "Setting up a waitress in the marina. It makes the capos nervous, sweetheart. A boss with a bleeding heart is a boss who makes mistakes." Carmine took a step toward the hallway, toward the bedroom, toward Finn. Sadie didn't think. The primal, violent instinct that had kept her alive on the streets took over entirely. She pulled the chef's knife from the counter, gripping the black handle so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Take one more step toward that hallway," Sadie hissed, her voice vibrating with a raw, feral hatred. "And I will open your throat." Carmine stopped. He looked at the blade, then at Sadie's eyes. She wasn't bluffing. She was terrified, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, but the knife was dead steady. Carmine threw his head back and laughed. "Oh, I like you. You got some teeth." He reached inside his maroon jacket. "But you don't bring a kitchen knife to a—" The elevator chimed. Carmine froze. The smug, nasty smile vanished from his face instantly, replaced by a sudden, sickening pallor. The steel doors opened. Roman walked in. He took one look at the scene. He saw Sadie pinned against the stove, clutching a carving knife, her eyes wide with terror. He saw Carmine standing in the center of his living room, his hand halfway inside his jacket. Roman didn't yell. He didn't draw a weapon. The violence that radiated from him was so absolute, so suffocating, that it sucked all the oxygen out of the room. "Carmine," Roman said. His voice was a whisper, but it sounded like a tomb slamming shut. "Boss," Carmine stammered, his hand shooting up in the air, instantly abandoning whatever weapon he was reaching for. I brought the manifests. Dante wasn't at the desk. I just came to drop them off." Roman walked slowly across the concrete floor. He didn't look at Sadie. His dead, slate-grey eyes were locked entirely on Carmine. "You bypassed my security," Roman stated softly. Roman moved faster than a man his size should be able to. His left hand shot out, grabbing the lapels of Carmine's cheap suit. He didn't punch him. He simply pivoted, using his massive body weight to hurl the thinner man across the kitchen. Carmine slammed face first into the black marble island. The sound of his jaw cracking against the stone echoed like a gunshot in the pristine apartment. Carmine screamed, a wet, gargling sound as he slid to the floor, clutching his bleeding mouth. Roman stepped over him. He grabbed Carmine's right hand, forcing it flat against the cold marble countertop. "You looked at what is mine," Roman whispered, leaning down so his mouth was inches from Carmine's ear. He brought his elbow down violently. The sickening crack of Carmine's forearm snapping backward made Sadie drop the knife. It hit the floor with a sharp clang. Sadie clapped her hands over her mouth, stumbling backward. The metallic smell of blood hit her nose, mixing with the scorched smell of boiling water overflowing on the stove. Her stomach violently heaved. She didn't swoon. She didn't faint delicately into a chair. She turned toward the stainless steel sink and threw up, her body shaking uncontrollably. Roman let go of Carmine. The man lay on the floor, weeping and hyperventilating in a puddle of his own blood. "Get out," Roman said to the broken man. "If you are in my city in 2 hours, I will feed you to the harbor." Carmine scrambled backward like a crab, clutching his ruined arm, slipping on the polished floor before stumbling into the elevator. The doors closed, taking the wailing sound with them. The apartment fell dead silent, broken only by the sound of Sadie dry heaving into the sink, her hands gripping the steel rim so hard her joints ached. She felt him approach. The heat of his body practically scorched her back. She flinched, curling inward, expecting the violence to spill over onto her. Instead, a heavy, warm hand gently pulled her hair back from her sweaty neck. Roman turned off the boiling pot of water with his other hand. He didn't speak. He reached over, turning on the cold tap, and wet a clean dish towel. He pressed the cool, damp cloth against the back of her neck. "Breathe," he commanded softly. Sadie collapsed against the counter, sliding down until she hit the floor. She pulled her knees to her chest, burying her face in her arms, sobbing. The adrenaline crashed out of her system, leaving nothing but cold, shaking terror. Roman sat down on the floor next to her. He didn't care about the blood on the marble or his expensive suit. He pulled her against his chest, wrapping his arms entirely around her shaking frame. She smelled the gun oil. She smelled the violence. But beneath it all, she smelled the cedar, and the terrifying realization hit her again. The monster holding her was the only safe place left in the world. 2 hours later, the blood was gone. Dante had come up with bleach and quiet efficiency, erasing any physical trace that Carmine had ever existed in the space. Finn was awake, sitting in his high chair in the dining room, happily smashing a piece of banana into the tray. Roman stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the dark harbor. He had changed his shirt. He wore a crisp white button-down, but his shoulders were rigid, drawn tight like a bowstring about to snap. Sadie sat at the kitchen island. She was exhausted, holding a glass of water she hadn't taken a sip of. "Dante is packing the car," Roman said, abruptly, his voice flat. He didn't turn around. "There is a house in Connecticut. Gated estate, 3 acres, private security on the perimeter. It's registered under a shell corporation. No one in the syndicate knows it exists." Sadie's fingers tightened around the glass. "What? You're leaving tonight?" Roman continued, his tone entirely clinical, stripping all emotion from the syllables. "Your wages will continue to be deposited. You won't have to work. The boy will have a tutor when he's old enough." "Roman." "I was arrogant," he cut her off, finally turning to face her. His eyes were haunted, a bleak, storm-grey wreckage. "I thought I could keep you here. I thought my name was enough to protect you. Carmine proved me wrong. If he had pulled that gun before I stepped off the elevator—" Roman stopped. A muscle feathered violently in his jaw. The thought of Sadie bleeding out on the marble floor alongside her child was a poison he couldn't swallow. "I am a violent man, Sadie," he said quietly. "My world is a rotting carcass. I will not let it infect you anymore. You are leaving." Sadie stared at him. A week ago, a month ago, she would have taken the offer. She would have run to the safety of a quiet, empty house in the suburbs and never looked back. But she wasn't the starving, broken waitress on the floor of the restaurant anymore. She stood up from the stool. She didn't tremble. She walked across the Persian rug, closing the distance between them until she was standing inches from his chest. "Do not treat me like I am fragile," Sadie said, her voice low and steady. Roman looked down at her. "You almost died today." "I almost died every day before you found me," she fired back, the raw honesty tearing through her throat. "I was dying of starvation. I was dying of exhaustion. I was losing my mind trying to keep my son alive in a freezing room with a bullet hole in the wall. You didn't pull me into danger, Roman. You pulled me out of it." "I bring violence everywhere I go," he warned, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, fighting the overwhelming urge to touch her. "Then bring it," Sadie whispered fiercely. "I am not afraid of your violence if it's standing between me and the rest of the world." Roman's breath hitched. The clinical detached mask he wore for the syndicate shattered completely. He reached out, his large hands grabbing either side of her face. His thumbs brushed fiercely against her cheekbones. He looked at her with a desperate, starving intensity. A man who had spent his entire life in the dark, suddenly staring directly at the sun. "If you stay," Roman rasped, his forehead dropping to rest against hers, "I will never let you go. There is no walking away from this. I am a selfish, ruthless bastard, Sadie. I will keep you." "Keep me then," she breathed against his lips. He kissed her. It wasn't a soft, romantic collision. It was desperate, bruising, and urgent. It was the clash of two survivors, broken in entirely different ways, realizing their jagged edges fit together perfectly. Sadie grabbed the front of his shirt, her fingers brushing against the hard leather of his shoulder holster, anchoring herself to the solid, immovable weight of him. She tasted the mint on his breath and the dark, possessive promise in his grip. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathing heavily. Roman's hand slid down to her waist, anchoring her against him. The terrifying, crushing weight that had sat on his chest for years felt entirely absent. A loud, wet babble broke the silence. They both turned. Finn was slamming his sticky fists against the plastic tray of his high chair, demanding attention. Roman let out a low, breathy laugh, a sound Sadie had never heard him make. He released her waist, walking over to the high chair. He picked up a damp cloth and gently wiped the mashed banana off the baby's face, ignoring the way Finn aggressively chewed on his scarred knuckle. Sadie watched them. She looked at the blood-stained chef's knife resting in the sink. She looked at the dark city outside the glass. And then she looked at the kitchen island, where the cheap, cloudy plastic baby bottle she had dropped at the restaurant was sitting right next to Roman Gallo's spare ammunition magazine. They didn't belong together. They defied every law of nature and logic. But as Roman picked her son up, resting Finn's head securely over his heart, Sadie knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. And that's the end of Sadie and Roman's story. What an absolute roller coaster. From collapsing on a restaurant floor in pure desperation to finding a fierce, unconventional safety in the arms of the city's most dangerous man. Sadie proved that survival isn't always pretty, but it's incredibly powerful. Did Roman's brutal but protective nature win you over? Let me know your favorite moment down in the comments. If you loved this grounded, raw Mafia romance, smash that like button, share the video with your friends, and hit subscribe so you never miss a new story. See you in the next one.